All right, let's talk about Chen et al. This study from 2026 was specifically in judoka that were fairly well trained. And what they did is they had a control group, and then they had two different groups that took part in power-based resistance training and short sprint interval training in the same session. And the only difference between those two groups was they swapped the order that they did those exercises in. This is a really interesting study. It's the first of this kind of concept, specifically in judoka, that I'm familiar with. Um, and it's something that I don't think has been done in other groups, but I could be wrong on that. So I wanted to go through this and really talk about the methods and the results and what we can and cannot take away from this study, because I do think it's really interesting and it's really exciting, but it's also really easy to take more away from this study than we should. So first and foremost, it's a really small study, small sample size, and I believe it was only 8 weeks. They had 24 athletes in total, split into three groups. So there were three groups of 8. What's really cool about this study is those three groups of 8 were evenly split by weight class. So we had one individual in each group from each weight class. So that was very well designed. But the biggest reason that this is important is when we're talking about skill athletes and we're talking about um, athletics outside of strength sport. We have very limited time to do strength and conditioning um, for our sport, but it is very important. Obviously, we want to really focus on getting as much skill acquisition and um, as much time with our technical practice as possible. So trying to find time efficient ways to progress and to do programming is really important. And so introduction gives us a good base of understanding of that short sprint intervals are pretty helpful, specifically in power output, as well as some other things. Not really specifically what we're talking about here because we're talking about specific measurements. One of the specific measurements was the specific judo fitness test, which has been used a lot in judo research. It's fairly well validated and accepted as a good indicator of judo specific performance. Essentially, what this is you have two individuals 6 meters apart. The person being tested is halfway in between them. All three of them have to be trained. And the individual in the center has to run back and forth and throw the two people as many times in a set amount of time as possible. You measure their heart rate as well, and that gives you your score, and there's normative data for that score as well. It's a really cool test. It's hard, but it is a pretty good indicator of how well you can do your judo. And typically the throw used is Ippon Seoinage. Moving on from there, in terms of methods and participants, again, 24 young male judo athletes who had, I believe, an average training age of somewhere in that 8 to 9 year window. So fairly well trained, but still young, and they were all experienced in national competition as well. They're all male, but again, there was one individual from each weight class in the three groups, which was pretty nice. In addition to that, these athletes also were already familiar with sprint training and resistance training. So they did have a week-long acclimation period, I believe. Yep, a 1 week familiarization, 1 week pre-test, then they did a 6 week training intervention. So again, a really short training intervention. And then 1 week they did the testing again. So the nice thing is that they did do a familiarization week on this so they could get used to the movements and what they were expected to do. So that removes one part of the bias and the confounders out of this whole situation. They then go into the different tests that they use. They use a pretty good barrage of tests, one of which was the counter movement vertical jump, 20-meter sprint, agility t-test, which is this little diagram here. Pretty standard sport training stuff, to be honest. Special judo fitness test, which I also explained. Strength performance was lower body maximal strength because they were only doing really lower body focused exercise. And that was with a 45-degree leg press. And they did 1 rep max testing on this as well. They also did the Wingate anaerobic power test. Again, pretty standard stuff. And then they did an incremental exercise test, which is also fairly standard. The incremental exercise test is a VO2 max test, which also really sucks if you've never done one before. Wingate does too. So I've heard. I've never had to do it, which is nice. Anyway, yeah, so the actual intervention that they did is in addition to their regular practice sessions. So all 3 groups went to their regular practice sessions, including the control group, because they didn't want actual judo training to be a confounding variable. So the 3 groups that were all from the same academy, so their training was all the same, which is really nice. They had 3-hour ish training sessions. The actual practice sessions really were between 100 and 120 minutes, 3 times a week. And then on the alternating days, so the days that they weren't training judo in the afternoon, they would come in to the lab and do the exercises set out for them. These were all supervised workouts because, again, 6 weeks training intervention, it's fairly easy to get the funding required to have them be supervised the whole time, which is actually really helpful because it makes sure that they are reaching the intensity that the researchers intended. So it removes a little bit of that variation as well. So the resistance training program that they used was back squat, leg press, and knee extension in a circuit with an intensity of 60% of maximal. And then they would get 15 seconds of rest in between trials and then 90 seconds between the circuit. So you'd have 15 seconds between exercise A, then you go to exercise B, then exercise C, 15 seconds in between each exercise, and then you get 90 seconds to take a break, and then you go back to the circuit again. And those circuits were 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. Then the individuals that started with the resistance training would do those things first after warming up. Then they would do a 10-minute break, and then they would do their short sprint intervals. The short sprint intervals were, I think, 5 seconds. Let's find it. Yes, 3 sets of 10 repetitions of 5 seconds of maximal effort running. 15 seconds of active rest, and then 3 minutes between each set. So you would do 5 seconds of maximal intensity sprinting, 15 seconds of active rest. So this isn't standing in place. This is light running or jogging or still moving around. You would do that 10 times. Then you would take a 3-minute break, and then you would do that again for 3 total sets. And then in addition to that, they would increase the repetitions by 1 each week. So you start with 10, and then you go to 11, 12, all the way up to 15. So again, if you started with resistance training, you would do those exercises. You would then take a 10-minute break, and then you would swap and you would do the sprint training. If you were in the sprint and then resistance training, all we did was swap it, or all they did was swap it. So they also measure RPE, or rating of perceived exertion, and this is just how hard it felt on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 being very difficult, 0 being really easy, basically sleeping. So, statistical analysis, nothing super fancy there. Excuse me with my messy highlighting. Let's get rid of that. So the results on this are obviously what everybody is here for. And unsurprisingly, both um, experimental groups improved in pretty much every measurement, and the control group did not. What's interesting about this is, again, the control group was actively training, but there were no statistically significant changes. Most likely, this is due to them being highly trained already. A lot of the fitness adaptations that they've already gotten have occurred over years and years of training. So they're already at a fairly high level. And so, in order for them to get better, it's going to take longer and it's going to take more work. So, that is unsurprising in this. What is surprising is there was an 100% adherence rate to this. So every single athlete completed all of the workouts that they were supposed to do, which is really exciting because that almost never happens. So where we see some kind of generalizations that make things seem more important than they are is with this results section here, and particularly this graph. So let me zoom in a little on this. The SSIT plus RT group is the group that did short sprint intervals first and then did resistance training after. Likewise, RT plus SSIT is the group that started with their sprints first. So, unsurprisingly, we have a lot of data that shows that generally you want to do the things that you care about most first in an exercise or in a workout session, right? The things that you need to focus on or improve upon the most go first. That is because you have the most energy, you are the freshest, you don't have fatigue fighting you, and so you can improve more on those as you go. So, unsurprisingly, things that are really, really related to sprinting, like the agility test and the 20-meter sprint, are showing better benefits for sprinting first. Sprinting is also really good for vertical jump because it's really quick rate of force. Your rate of force development is really, really high, so it is not unexpected at all to see greater improvements in vertical jump with our sprint training group. The Hedges G is really important. This shows us our effect size, but what's also interesting is the raw percentage change. And so the effect size basically is telling us whether or not we can attribute these changes to our intervention and how strong that intervention is. So the more spread you have, so if you've got a large group of people and they're all over the board, your Hedges G is going to take that into account. So percent change, average percent change does not take that into account. So this 12.1, we do have this plus minus 1.9, which shows us our standard deviation. However, when we plug that in and we get our Hedges G's, this kind of corrects for things and gives us, okay, how strong is the relationship between the intervention as a whole? So the higher this plus minus is, the higher the standard deviation, the lower your effect size will be, even if the average stays the same. So this 12.1% on its own would be really impressive, but if we had a standard deviation of like 6 or 7, this effect size would be much smaller because we've got a larger range of folks, right? So now we have someone who improved at 6%, but we had someone who improved at 18%. It's this huge difference in improvement, which means it's harder to attribute it specifically to the intervention that we did. That being said, moving on. Again, it is not surprising to see that our short sprints outperformed our resistance training first group in things like vertical jump, 20-meter sprint, agility t-test as well. When we get to our lower body strength, again, it is not surprising to see our resistance training group outperforms our sprinting group. They both did both sprinting and resistance training, but when we're referring to the first one. So These numbers here are not raw percentages. Okay, so again, this is the effect size. It's trivial and small. These numbers don't necessarily reflect absolute changes. So what we're really looking at is these changes here. So again, we can see this is a good example of how that spread on our standard deviation affects our effect size. Because if we go up here, we had a 6.5 change, percent change in our vertical jump and a 6.3% change in our lower body strength. Fairly similar, but the spread is much higher. So our lower body strength is a standard deviation of 3.1, whereas a 1.7, and you can see that significantly changes our power, our Hedges G effect size. And so in particular with the Hedges G, small and trivial are here. Once you start to get to 0.6, I think it's 0.6, then we get into a moderate. And then I think anything above, I want to say a 2 is a extreme. I could be wrong. They put it in here. It's up here. Again, we're getting into the weeds a little bit, and my effect sizes are a little rusty when they get up to the higher numbers because it's very unusual to see in most things, specifically in exercise science. Here we go. Anything larger than 4. So 2 to 4 is very large, and 4 is nearly perfect. So if you have an effect size of 4, that means there's very little variation. The intervention that you do is very, very good for most people or all people. So anyway, I'm really trying to keep this short, and I don't think I'm succeeding. This is what happens when you get really into the data. Anyway, so for lower body strength, and I think there was one more. Mean wattage. This is from our Wingate test. This is the average power. Those were it, I think. Yeah. These are the only two that responded better to our resistance training group that did resistance training first. Not a huge difference in effect size for our mean power. Still small effect sizes for our lower body strength. This is not surprising given the very small window in which they were exercising. 4.1 is pretty impressive. 6.3 also pretty impressive for a 6-week intervention. Not surprising to see. So everything else, for the most part, responded better to sprinting first compared to resistance training first. And if you are someone who does a lot of hybrid exercise, this will not be surprising to you, right? Our general rule when we are developing programs is you start with the most demanding things first if you don't have a specific focus that exempts you from that. So you would generally start with your power development exercises first, which can, in this case, include short sprint intervals. If we're doing longer sprint intervals, you normally want to put those towards the back end of your exercise selection. But in particular for these really, really short, almost exclusively power-based sprints, we want them towards the front. They're the most fatiguing, they require the most energy. And so those are the ones you want to get before you're fatigued. And then you would put your pure strength exercises next, and then your accessories. And your conditioning typically goes at the end for most folks. So this is pretty in line with general recommendations. And again, you can see too that when we're looking at like all these different measurements, we see very large increases in specifically our 20-meter sprint and our vertical jump. We see smaller changes in things like strength. We see smaller things in terms of our mean wattage. Peak power is much larger in the sprint group. What's really interesting, however, is that the special judo fitness test, they all improved and they had a moderate effect size. So this was really cool to see. You can see they're really, really close, and most of that is coming from a greater average change. The minus 4.5 is better. You want a lower score. And we've got a slightly larger spread, so it mediates things a little bit. If the spread was the same, this would be a higher effect score or effect size. So this is really cool to see, is that, again, the control largely did not change. We don't have the control data, but they said it was not statistically significant. And so they didn't put it in the actual data points, although I do think they included them in, yes, they did include them in this graph here. So this is our control group for the special judo fitness test. So there were some improvements, but if you look at the other two, significantly higher improvements. And what's really interesting is we have this one little line here that is a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the group and probably affected those findings a little bit more. So if we took that one particular person out, we would see an even smaller change here. Kind of interesting. Anyway, moderate effect size. So adding sprinting and resistance training helped this a lot. Now, again, just to really highlight things, because we've gone through kind of the findings, this is a small sample size and a short intervention. If we had a longer intervention or we had more people, things might change. This is not, the end all be all. Furthermore, this is specifically including both resistance training and your power-based, specifically power-based resistance training and short sprint interval training. If we had a group that was just resistance training and a group that was just short sprint interval training, we don't know what we would see. It's possible that including both of these in the same session is severely attenuating one of these measurements. We don't know. It's possible that if we had a group that just did sprints, that we would see an even larger drop off in our sprint speed. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if we found that. We can't say for certain. And this was a very, very limited exercise selection. The groups did 3 resistance training exercises. So while it does show us we can make really good improvements by using this framework, what it doesn't tell us is, could we make better improvements? 1, if we split those up, but 2, if we had more exercises. Now, of course, a limitation of that, practically speaking, is we only have so much time to do these exercises. So maybe this is a realistic exercise session for someone. That is certainly possible. And given these results, I would say this is a great way to improve power output and improve judo performance. So this is a really good study. Again, it's small. They did measure VO2 max, which favored the sprint group as well, which is not surprising. But in the future, it would be really nice to see a larger group, longer intervention, and perhaps split it up even more. So if you are in particular someone who really needs to work on their lower body strength, maybe it would be advisable to just do the power-based resistance training or doing strength-based resistance training exercises and leaving the sprints out of there. I don't think that would necessarily be true, but again, we don't know because we haven't tested it. So we can have all these kind of ideas about what might change, but until we test it, we'll have no idea. Ultimately, what this really recommends is that it is totally feasible to condense your sessions and do two things at once. Highlighting, it's probably best to do your sprint interval training first if things more directly related to power are your goal. If things like maximal strength, if things like average power over a longer period of time are more important than peak power, which for most judoka is normally not the priority, then doing your resistance training first might be more beneficial. Personally, in general, I would say start with the sprints first and then do your resistance training afterwards. Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the main reasons is, again, you want to be really fresh for those so you can get the most out of it. Your freshness matters a little bit less for strength exercises, even if they are power strength exercises. 5-second sprints are pure power. So those are really fatiguing. You'll want to start with those first. And I would say overall, based on the measurements that they took, not saying that these are the only measurements that matter, but we're really leaning into sprinting first being your better option. Because again, we've got all of these here that are in favor of sprinting first. We even get a little bit of extra VO2 max improvements, mostly because there's less of a spread. So I thought this was a really well done study. I would like to see it, the research question pursued further. I will not say that this tells us definitively anything. However, it does suggest that, again, prioritizing the attribute that you want first is ideal. If you're not really sure, I would say start with your sprints. Again, only if they're short sprints. If we're getting into our longer intervals, really, I would argue anything over like 15, 20 seconds, I would still be putting that at the back end of my workout and working on the strength stuff first. So I thought this was a cool study. I wanted to kind of go through it a little bit more and explain my own thoughts on it because it is fairly technical. And the effect sizes and percent changes can be a little weird when we start to look at very similar effect sizes with very different percent changes, or vice versa, very different effect sizes with very similar percent changes.